He had fought wars, silenced enemies, and worn the crown of a lion without ever bowing. But when Zara stood before him, demanding not love in the shadows, but power by his side, Elijah Thorne realized this was the one battle he could not win with blood. It was her eyes, fierce and unyielding, that forced him to choose between the empire he ruled and the woman who had become his only weakness. And in a world of betrayal and fire, the deadliest gamble was not war, it was love. The city did not look the same the next morning, though nothing had truly changed. Crescent Bay still shimmered in the distance, its glass towers cutting the sky like knives, its streets alive with the pulse of ambition, greed, and survival. But for Zara Khan, the world had been cracked open the night before, and the memory of strong arms shielding her, of eyes that burned with something both terrifying and magnetic, refused to leave her no matter how tightly she tried to shut it away. She sat in her office, piles of case files stacked like walls around her. Yet her pen hovered uselessly over paper as her mind replayed the blind date-turned battlefield. The way the chandeliers had rained glass, the sound of bullets biting into velvet walls, the sudden violence with which Elias had moved. No hesitation, no doubt, as if danger were the air he breathed. She had defended clients accused of terrible things before. She had read about men who thrived in the underworld. But nothing had prepared her for witnessing it so closely, for seeing charm and savagery contained in the same body, for feeling her heart race not only from fear, but from a dangerous attraction she wanted to deny. Maya's voice echoed in her ear, teasing from their last conversation, urging her to live a little. But Maya had no idea what kind of little Zara had lived last night, how close she had been to death, and how close to something that felt like falling. She closed her eyes and tried to anchor herself in the routine of her profession, the calm logic of the law, but the world outside her office refused to cooperate, as if sensing that her life had stepped off its rails. A knock at the door pulled her back, sharp and unexpected, and when she opened it she found Detective Ava Rodriguez standing there, rain still dripping from the brim of her coat, eyes sharp as if they could pierce through steel. Ava did not ask to come in. She walked in with the authority of someone who believed rules existed to be enforced and that everyone else was a potential criminal hiding behind excuses. Zara bristled at the intrusion but said nothing, sensing this visit was not routine. And she was right. Ava did not waste time with pleasantries. She spoke Elijah Thorne's name like a curse, her voice low but edged with heat, telling Zara that the man she dined with last night was no mysterious stranger, but the Lion himself, head of the Syndicate, a monster who built his empire on blood and fear. She warned her with a mix of bitterness and sincerity, insisting that whatever charm he carried was a mask, and that Zara had already stepped too close to a fire that would consume her whole. Zara clenched her jaw, defensive, not because she believed Ava, but because she didn't want to believe Ava was right, because part of her hated how her pulse quickened at the very mention of his name, how her heart betrayed her logic with the memory of his hand at her back as he shielded her from flying bullets. She dismissed the detective coolly, insisting she had no connection to Thorne and never would, but Ava's smirk lingered as she left, as if she had seen the crack in Zara's voice that betrayed otherwise. Hours passed, but concentration never came. Every clock ticked louder, every shadow in the room seemed to whisper of him, until at last she packed her files and left the office, craving the anonymity of city streets, the comfort of losing herself in the crowd. Rain glazed the pavement, neon lights blurred across wet asphalt, and Zara walked faster than usual, heels striking sharp against stone, trying to drown out the storm inside her chest. She told herself she would never see him again, that whatever thread had pulled them together was cut the moment she fled the gilded cage, that the sensible thing, the on-belly thing, was to bury the night like a dream turned nightmare. Yet when she reached the corner near her apartment, her breath froze in her throat, because there he was. Elijah stood under the lamplight, rain dripping from his dark suit, broad shoulders soaked but unmoving, as if the storm bent around him instead of touching him. He did not speak immediately, and that silence was heavier than words, a silence filled with power and patience, the kind of patience predators carried before striking. Zara's first instinct was to run again, but her feet betrayed her, rooted to the sidewalk, her pulse louder than the rain, and when he finally lifted his gaze to hers, those eyes burned with the same dangerous certainty she had seen in the chaos of the club. His voice cut through the night, deep and steady, carrying not threat but possession. "You ran once, Zara," he said, every syllable laced with iron and fire, "but I won't let you run again." Zara's heels struck the marble steps in a desperate rhythm as she fled the gilded cage, her breath tearing through her chest, the glittering skyline of Crescent Bay warping in her tear-streaked vision, until the city looked like a dream unraveling in shards of light. The cold wind whipped her hair across her face, but she barely noticed, too consumed by the echo of chaos inside the supper club, by the sharp images branded into her memory. The shattering chandeliers raining glass, the screams tangled with gunfire, the blur of masked men raising weapons, and then him, the man she had thought was Elias Thorne, stepping forward like a shadow pulled from the heart of violence, his movements precise, merciless, practiced in a way that no ordinary man could ever be. He had shielded her without hesitation, body angled between her and the storm, muscles taut with fury as he disarmed one attacker and dropped another with a strike so final it left no room for doubt. That vision clung to her now, chasing her through the rain-soaked streets. The duality of a man who had laughed softly with her over wine, who had guided her gently across the dance floor, only to transform in an instant into something primal and terrifying, a lion unmasked in the middle of the glittering city. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she pushed forward, weaving past startled pedestrians and gleaming cars that splashed water over the curbs, each step driven by a frantic need to put distance between herself and the man whose hands still lingered like fire against her skin. She wanted to forget the way his eyes had burned when they met hers beneath the terrace lights, wanted to erase the way her heart had stuttered when he whispered something low and unguarded as they swayed to the jazz band, but memory betrayed her, replaying each second with cruel clarity until she felt like she was dancing again, even as she ran. Her apartment building loomed ahead, the lobby lights glowing faintly like a beacon, and she stumbled inside, nodding distractedly at the doorman, her throat too tight to manage words. The elevator doors closed around her, and for the first time since she bolted, she was surrounded by silence. But silence was worse. It left her alone with the storm inside. She pressed her back against the mirror, clutching her bag to her chest, her reflection staring back pale and shaken, mascara smudged, hair wild, lips trembling with words she couldn't give voice to. Who was that woman staring back? Not the Zara Khan who walked into the restaurant hours ago, crisp and composed in her emerald dress, ready to tolerate a blind date as a favor to her best friend. This was a stranger, someone who had seen death brush close, someone who had looked into the eyes of a man whispered about in courtrooms and police files. Someone who could not deny the cruel truth that along with fear had come something else, something darker, something she didn't want to name. The elevator chimed and carried her up, but her mind sank deeper into the night's chaos. Her body replaying the way his arm had wrapped around her waist when he shoved her out of a bullet's path, how tightly he had held her, as if her life meant something to him, as if she weren't just a stranger caught in the crossfire. Zara staggered into her apartment and slammed the door shut, twisting the lock, her chest rising and falling in violent tremors, as though the danger might still be on her heels. She tossed her bag onto the sofa, stripped her heels off with shaking hands, and let herself collapse against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the cold wooden floor, legs drawn to her chest. For a long moment she sat there in the dark, only the city's glow seeping faintly through her curtains, and she wept, quiet, angry tears born not just of fear, but of confusion, of betrayal, of something she hated to admit. She should despise him. should curse the man for pulling her into his bloody orbit, should cling to the safety of the law, of reason, of the world she had fought so hard to build, brick by brick with integrity and discipline. But beneath the horror, her heart whispered treacherous things. She remembered the warmth of his hand at the small of her back as they danced, the rare softness in his eyes when the world had stilled around them. And most damning of all, she remembered the way she felt safe in those few seconds he had stood between her and death, even though he was the most dangerous man she had ever met. The thought made her stomach twist, and she pressed her palms against her temples, trying to will it away, whispering to herself that it was adrenaline, trauma, nothing more. Her phone buzzed on the sofa, Maya's name flashing across the screen, but she couldn't answer, not now, not when her voice would crack and betray everything she couldn't yet explain. The phone stopped, then started again, then finally fell silent, leaving only the hum of the city outside, the rhythm of her breathing, and the echo of words unsaid. She dragged herself into the bathroom, splashed cold water on her face, stared into the mirror until her blurred reflection pinned into something almost familiar again. "You're stronger than this," she whispered to her reflection, though the words trembled. "You don't need him, you don't." She dried her face, stripped out of the dress that still carried the scent of wine and smoke, and wrapped herself in a robe, curling onto the sofa like a wounded animal trying to protect itself. But even then, exhaustion refused to bring peace. Every time she closed her eyes, the night replayed, his voice low and steady as chaos erupted around them, his gaze searing into her, as though he had known her far longer than a single evening, as though he had already chosen her in a way she could not unchoose. Zara turned on the television, letting the noise fill the space, but the news anchors already spoke of the attack at the Gilded Cage, speculating about rival factions, whispering names that twisted in her gut. She muted the screen, unable to hear it, unwilling to let the world confirm what she already feared. Hugging a pillow to her chest, she stared out at the city skyline, its towers glittering like watchful eyes, and whispered to the night a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. "I will not see him again." But the words felt fragile, hollow, because deep inside, beneath fear and reason and denial, she already knew he would not let her run forever. The morning crept in with reluctant light, pale streaks slanting through Zara's blinds as though even the sun was hesitant to touch her after the night she had endured, and she sat at the edge of her sofa with her hair in tangles, her skin clammy with the remnants of fear, whispering again to herself that she would never see him, never think of him, never allow his shadow into her life again. Though even as the words left her lips, she knew she was lying, because the image of him, the man who had torn through gunfire with the grace of a predator and the precision of something far more dangerous than human, was carved into her mind so deeply it felt like a scar. She pushed herself up, forcing her limbs into motion, stumbling toward the kitchen where the smell of stale coffee grounds clung to the air, and when she tried to make a fresh pot, her fingers betrayed her, trembling so hard that she spilled half of it across the counter, swearing under her breath, furious at her own weakness. She had built her reputation on control, on precision, on never letting anyone see her falter. And yet here she was, unraveling over a man she had known for only a handful of hours, a man who had already shattered every barrier she thought unbreakable. She dressed in haste, choosing a sharp black suit, her armor of choice, hoping the rigid lines and silk blouse might press her back into the shape of the woman she had always been. But as she caught her reflection in the mirror, she saw the tremor still in her eyes, that wild look of someone who had stared into the abyss and wasn't sure if she had walked away intact. The city was already awake by the time she stepped out, horns blaring, people rushing, the hum of normal life mocking the chaos still roaring in her veins, and she clung to the rhythm of footsteps, the press of bodies on the subway, the weight of her briefcase as though these ordinary things might drown out the extraordinary truth gnawing at her. At the courthouse, marble floors gleamed under harsh lights. Colleagues greeted her with polite nods, their words muffled as if coming from far away, and she smiled faintly, mechanically, moving through the motions of a woman who belonged, though her mind kept replaying flashes of last night. the way the chandelier shattered, the way his arm pulled her close, the way his eyes locked with hers as if the whole room could burn, and he would still never let her go. She shook it off with a sharp inhale, burying herself in files, opening a thick folder and forcing her eyes to scan the dense lines of text. But the letters blurred into meaningless ink, her thoughts slipping again and again to that gnaw. Me she had overheard on the news. The lion. It echoed with menace and inevitability, and when she shut the folder at last, pressing her forehead against her palm, her door opened with a soft knock that carried weight far heavier than the sound. Detective Ava Rodriguez stepped in, her coat damp from rain, her dark eyes keen and unwavering, scanning the room like she already owned the truth hidden inside. And Zara straightened immediately, pushing the mask of composure across her features as if it could shield her. Ava wasted no time with pleasantries, her voice low and precise as she spoke of the attack at the gilded cage, her tone laced with suspicion, as if she already knew exactly who had been there, exactly what had unfolded. Zara tried to interrupt, to deny, but Ava pressed harder, naming him outright. Elijah Thorne, the lion, the man whose empire stretched into every shadowed corner of the city. And the sound of his name spoken aloud made Zara's chest tighten until breathing felt like a betrayal. She forced her lips into a thin line, denying with cool professionalism, insisting she had no ties, no knowledge beyond rumor, but Ava's smirk betrayed disbelief, her sharp gaze dissecting every flicker in Zara's eyes. The detective leaned closer, her voice dropping to a blade's edge, warning her that once Elijah Thorne touched someone's life, he never released them, that his charm was only the lure, and what followed was ruin. Zara clenched her fists at her sides, anger flaring through her fear. Anger at being cornered, judged, treated like prey when she had spent her life building herself into steel, and she snapped back that she was no one's possession, no man's pawn, that she made her own choices. For a heartbeat, silence crackled between them, and then Ava simply straightened, studying her like a puzzle she hadn't solved yet, and with a final nod that felt like both way, orienting and promise, she left. The door clicked shut and Zara sagged into her chair, her breath shuddering out of her, the walls of her office pressing in with a weight she couldn't hold off forever. She told herself again it was over, that she would cut it off, return to her world of order, of law, of facts and arguments. But when she caught her reflection in the rain-streaked window, she saw not the woman of logic she had always been, but someone haunted, someone marked, someone who could not stop hearing his voice in the dark spaces of her mind. And as the hours dragged on, as the rain fell harder against the glass, she realized with a sinking certainty that the line she kept drawing in her head was nothing more than sand, and the tide of him was already rising, already erasing every boundary she thought could keep him out. The rain had not stopped since Ava's departure, a steady rhythm against the courthouse windows that mirrored the relentless pounding of Zara's heart. And as the silence of her office swallowed her whole, she pressed her palms against the desk, staring at the neat stacks of case files as though their rigid order might rescue her from the chaos clawing at her insides. But the letters swam and blurred, words collapsing into nothing because her mind refused to settle, circling instead around the fragments Ava had left behind. His name, his empire, the promise that once touched by him, she would never be free. She stood abruptly, unable to breathe in that confined space, and stepped into the hallway, heels clicking against polished floors that echoed too loud in her ears, her stride quick and sharp, as though she could outrun the shadow pressing closer with every step. The world outside the courthouse had a damp glow, neon bleeding across wet pavement, the city alive with honking horns and murmured conversations, and for a fleeting moment she thought if she just blended into the crowd, just moved fast enough, she could lose the sensation of being watched. But it followed her, that prickling awareness at the nape of her neck, and she turned once, Sharside, ply, scanning the street with narrowed eyes, catching nothing but strangers huddled under umbrellas, rushing through the storm, and still her pulse refused to settle, whispering that unseen eyes lingered in the distance. She told herself it was paranoia, the residue of violence, the echo of fear. But deep down, another voice, quieter and far more dangerous, told her it was him, that Elijah was never far, that the lion never let go of prey once his gaze had claimed it. Shoving the thought aside, she made her way home, the subway clattering in bursts of metallic thunder, the crowd pressing close, the scent of damp coats and city grime suffocating her, and she clung to the steel pole, eyes closed, forcing her breath to steady, forcing herself back into the body of Zara Khan, attorney, fighter, a woman who bowed to nothing, not even the weight of a crime lord's stare. Yet when she reached her apartment, fumbling with the keys under the flickering hallway light, the quiet that greeted her inside was oppressive, her own reflection in the darkened window unsettling, as though it belonged to someone she no longer recognized, someone softer, more fragile, cracked open by the memory of a man she should hate but couldn't erase. She dropped her briefcase, kicked off her heels, moved through the apartment with restless energy, pacing between the kitchen and the living room as though searching for an anchor, and when she finally stopped, leaning against the counter, she realized her hands were shaking again. With a growl of frustration, she reached for her phone, thumb hovering over Maya's name, craving the grounding warmth of her best friend's voice. But before she could press it, she froze, the soft hum of something unnatural brushing against her awareness. A shift of air, a subtle creak of the old floorboards, the undeniable sensation that she was not alone. Her gaze darted to the shadows pooling in the corner of her apartment, her breath caught halfway in her chest, and though her rational mind screamed it was imagination, her instincts, honed sharper than she realized, told her otherwise. She moved slowly, every nerve stretched taut, her heart slamming against her ribs as she whispered to herself for calm, for courage, and when a sudden clap of thunder rattled the windows, she flinched, dropping the phone, the screen cracking against the tile. She bent to retrieve it, cursing under her breath, and in that bent moment she caught a glimpse, just a flicker in the glass reflection, of something tall, a silhouette that didn't belong, there and gone before she could whirl to face it. Panic shot through her veins like lightning, her body torn between the instinct to flee and the demand to stand her ground, and she did the only thing she could. She backed toward the door, pulse roaring in her ears, whispering to herself that if she left now, if she just stepped outside, she could breathe again. But her hand hesitated on the lock because another truth slithered into her chest, a truth she did not want to face. Part of her wasn't afraid of what might stand in the shadows. Part of her was afraid of what it would mean if it was him, if Elijah had found her, if those eyes were once again fixed on her in a way that promised she would never be the same. The silence stretched, heavy and endless, broken only by the storm outside. And Zara stood frozen in that space between terror and yearning, every second dragging her deeper into the realization that no matter how far she tried to run, the echo of him was already here, rooted inside her, waiting for the moment she would have no choice but to face it. Zara's breath caught in her throat as the silence pressed harder, her hand hovering at the lock as though the act of leaving could dissolve the shadows that clung to the corners of her apartment. But then a voice, low and steady, slipped through the storm like smoke, sending a violent shiver racing down her spine. "If you wanted me gone, you wouldn't key? Kept looking for me in the dark." She spun, her pulse exploding in her chest, and there he was, no longer a phantom of imagination, but solid and undeniable. Elijah Thorne standing near the window, where the lightning framed his figure in stark silver, his suit damp at the shoulders, as though he had walked through the rain without care, his gaze fixed on her with that impossible intensity that both terrified and tethered her. For a moment, words abandoned her, her lips parted in a soundless protest as her mind scrambled for reason, for law, for anything that could shield her from the reality that the most feared man in Crescent Bay was inside her sanctuary, uninvited, unshaken, claiming the air as though it had always belonged to him. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to rise even though it trembled, demanding how he had found her, how he had entered. But he only tilted his head slightly, a ghost of a smile touching his mouth, not arrogance, but something darker, something that suggested he had always known where to find her, always known when she would be alone, that her walls and locks meant nothing against the reach of the lion. Her anger surged like a defense, burning through the fear, and she snapped that he had no right, that she wanted nothing to do with him. Her voice sharp, but even to her own ears the edge wavered because beneath it lay a truth she didn't want to admit, that a part of her wasn't asking him to leave. Elijah stepped closer, slow, deliberate, like a predator unwilling to startle its prey. Yet his presence carried no mockery, only gravity, as he said her name like it belonged to him, each syllable dragging gooseflesh across her skin. And when he reached the glow of the lamp, she saw the faint bruise along his jaw, the hidden fatigue in the lines of his face, proof that the night had not left him untouched either. Something inside her twisted at that. Unwanted compassion rising against her will, and she bit it back, retreating a step, warning him again that she wanted distance, that she was not a woman to be owned, and his eyes softened, just slightly, like he had expected her fire, and respected it, though his reply was a quiet thunder. "You're not mine because I demand it, Zara. You're mine because I already know I can't let you walk away." Her chest constricted, fury clashing with an ache she could not smother, and she whispered that he was insane, that whatever game he thought he was playing would not work on her, but the words lost strength as he moved closer still, until the storm outside seemed to fade, until the only thing she could hear was the slow rhythm of his breathing, the unyielding certainty in his stance. She told herself to move, to push him back, to reclaim the space he had stolen, but her body betrayed her, rooted to the floor, caught in the gravity of a man who lived like danger was his second skin, and when his hand brushed the edge of her table, his fingers trailing across the wood, it was as though he was marking not just her home, but her, leaving an invisible claim she could not scrub away. He did not touch her, not yet, but the distance shrank until the air vibrated with unspoken war, her will against his certainty, her law against his chaos, and though every rational part of her screamed to resist, another part whispered that the most terrifying thing was not his presence, it was the way her heart leaned toward it. Elijah's gaze never left hers, unwavering, unblinking, as if he could see the storm inside her as clearly as the storm outside, and when he finally spoke again, his words were softer, almost human, almost vulnerable. "Last night wasn't chance, Zara. You weren't meant to be collateral. You were meant to see me." She inhaled sharply, her defenses shattering under the weight of a confession she didn't ask for, didn't want, but couldn't unhear, and the silence that followed was unbearable, charged with all the things she would not admit, all the things he would not apologize for. Her fists curled at her sides, nails biting her palms, and she whispered through clenched teeth that he needed to leave, that she could not, would not, live under the shadow of a man like him. But instead of arguing, instead of forcing, he held her gaze with that relentless intensity and said simply, "Then say you don't think about me, and I'll walk away." Her throat locked, the lie perched on her tongue but refusing to fall, because the truth burned too hot. And he saw it, saw everything in her silence, and though his mouth curved with victory, there was no triumph in it, only inevitability, as if he too were bound to something he hadn't chosen. The thunder cracked again, rattling the glass, and still they stood, locked in a battle no weapon could end, the air between them too thick, too dangerous, too alive, and Zara realized with a bone-deep chill that whatever choice she thought she had, it was already gone, swallowed the moment she let him pull her into that dance beneath the city lights. The night clung to Zara like a second skin as she left the courthouse, her heels clicking too loudly on the marble floor, and she told herself she was fine, that the chaos of Elijah Thorne should have ended with that terrible night at the gilded cage. Yet the truth pressed at her chest, heavy and restless, as though she carried a storm inside her ever since, because every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, dark, magnetic, and far too close to danger. And every time she opened them, she found the city whispering his name in shadows, people murmuring "the lion" in bars and alleys, their voices coded in fear and respect. Zara hated herself for listening, for caring, for wanting to know if he was real beyond the mask of power, and she kept repeating he was a monster, that monsters belonged in cages, yet her heart insisted there was something else buried beneath his steely exterior, and that contradiction tore her apart more cruelly than any cross-examination ever had. Maya noticed the change immediately. Over coffee the next morning, she leaned across the table, her dark eyes narrowing as she said, "You're distracted, Z," fingers tapping the mug, and Zara forced a smile that cracked at the edges with a simple, "just work." But Maya scoffed, brushing her curls back, accusing her of thinking about the mystery man who had turned a supper club into a war zone. Zara froze, whispered her name in protest, but Maya cut her off sharply, warning that men like that don't fall in love, they consume, and Zara's silence spoke louder than words until Maya reached across the table, squeezed her hand, and begged her to promise she would keep away. Zara whispered the promise, but she already knew she couldn't keep it, because he had already found her, not with threats but with shadows. An unfamiliar car parked too long near her office, a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, Silas leaning against a lamppost one late evening, silent as stone. They weren't predators, they were guardians, sent by a man who refused to let her go, and the realization made her pulse quicken with equal parts fear and longing. When she discovered the note slipped beneath her office door, her hands trembled at the bold, precise handwriting that read, "Meet me where the flowers bloom under the stars. Midnight." There was no signature, but she didn't need one, her instinct screaming it was him, while her logic told her to burn it and forget. Yet when midnight neared, she found herself walking through Crescent Bay's botanical gardens, the gates left unlocked as though waiting just for her, the air thick with jasmine and earth. Moonlight spilled across rows of exotic flowers, and there he was beneath a canopy of wisteria, his tall frame softened by scattered lantern light, no longer a lion ready to strike, but a man waiting, vulnerable in the stillness. And when he said, "You came," his voice carried more relief than arrogance. Zara's throat tightened as she asked, "Why?" "Why?" And he tilted his head, studying her as though she were the answer to a question that had plagued him for years, replying, "Because I couldn't let you think that night was all I am." She folded her arms, clinging to control, asking if he was just a man who killed without blinking, a lie wrapped in charm, but his lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile as he said, "A man who's been at war with himself longer than you've been alive," stepping closer with the caution of someone approaching a wild creature. "You saw the lion," he murmured. "Tonight I want you to see the man." But Zara shook her head, torn between fury and fascination, insisting the man runs an empire of blood and fear, to which he gently corrected, "The man protects a city that would eat itself alive without order." His gaze darkening with unspoken truths as he admitted he had never wanted the throne, that it was a legacy carved in violence passed like a curse, his eyes turning to the trembling flowers as he confessed he dreamed of walking away, of building something real, not hiding in shadows, before adding bitterly that monsters aren't given happy endings, unless someone believes they can be more. The weight of his stare pressed against her chest until she whispered, "Why me?" And he answered, "Because you see through me. Because you didn't run the moment I touched you on that dance floor." She bit her lip at the memory of feeling safe in his arms amid chaos, hating the part of herself that wanted that safety, yet unable to deny it. And then he pulled a white gardenia from his coat, holding it out, not like an offering, but like a plea. "One chance, Zara, that's all I ask." The flower trembled in her hand as she took it, a simple, dangerous gift, unlike anything else he could have given her, and when she asked what if she said no, he promised to disappear from her life without threats, without shawl. Dows, just gone. A promise that struck harder than an ultimatum, because she realized she didn't want him gone, though that terrified her more than the gunman had. Silence stretched between them, as the garden seemed to hold its breath, and when her lips parted with no words, Elijah leaned closer, slow and deliberate, brushing her cheek with a warm hand as he murmured, "You don't have to answer now, but know this. When I said you're mine, it wasn't a claim of power. It was a truth I can't undo. Her pulse thundered as honesty, not violence, became the most dangerous thing about him, and when she stepped back, clutching the gardenia, whispering that she didn't know if she could do this, he simply nodded, quiet and resigned, saying, "Then let me show you, not with words, with time. Let me prove I can be more than the lion." Her chest ached with conflict as his hand slipped away, leaving a loss that felt like a wound, and he turned into the shadows, saying softly, "Go home, Zara. Think. Hate me if you must. But don't forget what you felt tonight." She stood rooted, the scent of wisteria clinging to her, until she finally walked away, every step heavier than the last, unaware of Silas watching from the distance to ensure her safety, a silent message that she was already under their watch whether she wanted it or not, and though her stomach twisted with unease, a traitorous part of her felt safe. At home, she dropped the gardenia into a glass of water, staring at it like it held her answers, its bloom impossibly white against the dim room, mocking her with its fragility and strength as she buried her face in her hands, whispering, "This is insane," before brushing her lips unconsciously where his touch had lingered. Sleep was restless, filled with dreams of wisteria and whispered promises, and in the morning the flower was still alive, just like the imprint of him on her soul. She tried to armor herself with court filings, phone calls, and deadlines, but the defenses felt thinner now, every shadow heavier with his unseen presence, every sound behind her making her woo, Ender if he was near. Maya noticed again, but Zara deflected, unable to admit that the man she should despise had offered her something purer than anyone else, unable to confess she had almost wanted him to kiss her. The thought burned and soothed her all at once, and by the week's end the gardenia still hadn't wilted, Elijah's words echoing in her mind. "Let me prove I can be more than the lion." She clenched her fists, telling herself it was manipulation, yet her heart whispered it was truth, a truth more dangerous than lies, blurring the sharp lines she had built her life upon into colors she didn't know how to name. That night, she stood by her window, watching Crescent Bay glitter like shards of glass, knowing he was out there somewhere, feeling the invisible tether between them tug with every beat of her heart, whispering she should hate him, but hearing the uncertainty in her own voice, realizing the truth was louder. She didn't hate him, she feared what it meant. The gardenia glowed in moonlight, its reflection shimmering in the glass, a reminder, a promise, a threat all woven into one, following her into her dreams of terraces, gardens, fire, and the strange peace of his embrace. And when dawn broke, the bloom was still alive, just like the storm he had left inside her. She cradled it gently, inhaling its delicate fragrance as law and desire clashed within her, knowing Elijah Thorne was no longer just a name whispered in shadows, but a storm waiting at her door. And part of her, despite everything, wanted to open it, the line between fear and longing thinner than ever before. The night shattered like glass when the gunfire erupted, echoing through the streets with a violence that made the ground tremble beneath Zara's feet. Elijah had barely turned when Isadora's men surged forward, shadows in tailored suits, eyes glinting with malice, weapons drawn as if they had been waiting for this exact moment. The air smelled of blood and gunpowder, harsh and metallic, every breath like swallowing shards. Elijah's movements were fluid, predatory, his body twisting with the grace of a man who had lived inside war his whole life, every strike deliberate, every dodge precise. But there were too many of them, and the darkness seemed to multiply their shapes, clawing closer with every heartbeat. Zara stood frozen at first, her body trembling with fear and the helpless ache of watching him fight as if the world was trying to devour him. She wanted to scream, to run, but something rooted her to the ground, something deeper than fear, something that felt like destiny. A blade flashed too close to Elijah's side, and for one agonizing second, Zara thought he would fall. Then Silas appeared, silent as a storm breaking, his hands fast, his gun faster, his presence a shadow of death cutting through the chaos. The loyalty between them was wordless, carved into blood and years of survival, and together they pushed back against the tide. The clash was brutal, bone against bone, steel against steel, the kind of violence that stripped the night bare and left it raw. Zara's heart pounded with every cry, every grunt, every gunshot, her body quivering as if the bullets were flying through her veins too. When the last man fell, silence returned, heavy and suffocating, broken only by Elijah's uneven breathing. Silas stood steady beside him, face unreadable, as if saving his friend's life was just another ordinary duty. Elijah wiped blood from his jaw, his eyes finding Zara, searching, almost desperate, as though needing to know she still saw him as more than a monster. But her gaze was torn, both horrified and drawn, her body refusing to choose between running and reaching for him. Then, like a spark igniting the city, Maya's exposé dropped into the world. Screens lit up across New York, headlines screaming with truths buried for too long, and Zara's name rose like a phoenix from the ashes of suspicion. Every photograph, every document, every recording, Maya Khan had laid them bare, dragging the lies into the light until even strangers on the street whispered Zara's innocence. The city gasped, devoured the story, and in the chaos, Zara felt the weight of her chains fall away. But freedom didn't erase the memory of Elijah's fists, his rage, his violence. Freedom didn't quiet the storm in her chest. Detective Rodriguez watched the city's reaction from her dim-lit office, the humiliation curdling like poison in her veins. Her evidence shredded, her reputation cracked. She clenched her jaw and swore she would not bow, not to Elijah, not to Zara, not to the truth that threatened her power. Even discredited, she still had fire, and she whispered to the walls that this war was not over. Meanwhile, Elijah sought Zara out, his steps heavy, his eyes shadowed by battles both fought and brewing. He held something in his hands, a folder, thick, scarred at the edges, its weight heavy with secrets. When he placed it before her, the world seemed to hold its breath. Inside was Isadora's confession, every line signed in her venomous hand, every word a blade cutting through the lies. It was proof, undeniable, that Zara had been nothing more than a pawn in a game she never chose to play. Her breath shook as she read, her vision blurring with tears that burned and refused to fall. The man she had feared, the man who had danced with her under false lights, was also the man who had fought to clear her name. But Zara lifted her chin, her voice trembling not with weakness, but with strength born of scars. "This isn't enough," she whispered, her words slicing through the silence. Elijah's brow furrowed, confusion shadowing his steel. "You're free now, Zara," he said, his tone low, his accent wrapping around her name like smoke. But she shook her head, her eyes blazing with a fire he hadn't expected. "Freedom isn't what I want," she said, her voice steady. Then, as her heart raced, "I won't be hidden in the shadows, Elijah. I won't be your secret, your fragile thing you protect and cage." Her words struck him harder than any bullet had, because they cut through the armor he wore, straight into the lion's heart. "I want more," she continued, her body trembling but her resolve unshaken. "I want partnership. I want equality. If you want me by your side, then it won't be as something you own. It will be as someone you stand with." The silence that followed was heavier than the battle had been, thicker than blood, sharper than any blade. Elijah's jaw tightened, his breath slow, his mind caught in a storm of instincts and desires. He had always ruled, always commanded, always taken without question. To share power was to tear down the crown he had forged from fear and fire. His eyes darkened, not with anger, but with something deeper, more dangerous. Hesitation. Could a lion truly share his throne, his crown, his very soul? The question hung between them like a blade, trembling, waiting to fall. And in that pause, Zara knew the truth. Her demand was a line drawn in blood, one he would either cross to reach her or retreat from and lose her forever. The night closed in around them, breathless and uncertain, the world watching to see whether the lion's heart could bend without breaking. And in that fragile silence, the chapter ended, not with victory, not with surrender, but with the sharp edge of possibility, waiting to carve the future into flesh. The silence between them deepened until it felt like a living thing, pressing on Zara's chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs, and she stood her ground, even as Elijah's shadow towered over her, his hesitation flickering across his face like a man caught between fire and water. And for a moment she wondered if the lion inside him would devour her demand or crumble beneath it, because his eyes were unreadable, torn between fury at being challenged and the raw ache of knowing he could lose her if he refused. And the room seemed to shrink with that weight, walls trembling as if lists. Teening to the war waged between them until Elijah finally exhaled, slow, rough, his jaw flexing, his hand curling into a fist at his side, his silence louder than gunfire, and Zara's pulse hammered because silence was the cruelest answer of all. Yet she refused to falter, refused to step back, her chin tilting higher, her voice low but firm when she whispered, "I will not be less than what I am." And those words struck him like a bullet to the chest, his throat tightening as memory after memory clawed at him, visions of power taken, thrones seized, crowns forged in blood, and now this woman, this fragile, fierce, impossible woman, was demanding to stand where no one else had ever dared, beside him, not beneath him, and he felt the crown he wore, invisible but crushing, shift uneasily on his head, as if even gold knew it might have to bend, and then the world outside their fragile stillness crashed back in, the echo of Isadora's men not entirely gone, shadows still prowling the edges of his empire, enemies rising in the wake of betrayal, the air tense with unfinished wars, and yet all of it felt distant compared to this moment, this demand that threatened to unmake him more than any bullet could. And Zara's heart thudded with the unbearable weight of waiting, each second dragging like chains across the floor, until finally Elijah moved, his hand lifting not to strike or pull her close, but to touch the edge of the folder still lying between them, his fingers brushing the paper that had freed her and damned Isadora. And his voice came low, gravel-worn, broken by conflict. "You don't know what you're asking." And Zara flinched but didn't break, her eyes steady, her voice trembling but strong as she answered, "I know exactly what I'm asking." And that truth tore through the fragile veil between them, ripping the hesitation open because it wasn't innocence speaking anymore. It was a woman who had bled, who had been accused, who had survived, and Elijah saw it, saw the steel beneath her softness, the fire beneath her fear, and for the first time in years he felt something foreign clawing at his chest, respect tangled with desire, admiration chained to longing, and it terrified him more than any enemy ever had, because respect meant equality, and equality meant surrender, and surrender was something the lion had never known. And yet her gaze held him there, demanding he try, demanding he prove that what they shared wasn't just hunger and fire, but something greater. And as the tension burned the very air, Silas's voice cracked through the silence, sharp and urgent, announcing that Isadora's men were regrouping, that the city was still bleeding, and the fragile pause broke, replaced by the roar of reality as Elijah straightened, his expression shuddering, but his eyes betraying the storm inside. And Zara felt the shift, the battle postponed but not forgotten, and together they stepped into the night where fire still burned, bodies still lay, and betrayal still reeked in the air, the streets lit with red and blue as sirens howled, the city itself a battlefield, and Elijah moved like a shadow through it, Zara close behind, their steps mismatched, but tied by something stronger than fear. And when the next wave came, guns raised, teeth bared, they didn't face it apart, but side by side, her hand clutching his sleeve, his body a shield, yet his eyes flicking to her with every strike, as though reminding himself she was not a piece to protect, but a force to fight with. And when Silas took a blade meant for Elijah, collapsing with a grimace but no scream, Zara was the one who tore fabric from her dress to press against the wound, her hands steady even as her heart raced, and Elijah looked at her then as though seeing her for the first time, not just as a woman who danced with him, who trembled before him, but as a woman who could bleed for his world and not shatter, and that vision cracked something open inside him, a realization that roared. Louder than the gunfire. He could not cage her, because caging her meant breaking her, and breaking her meant breaking himself. And so the battle raged, steel and flame and betrayal, until at last the last of Isadora's men fell, the night trembling with the silence of victory, and Elijah stood in the ruins of it, chest heaving, blood staining his hands, his eyes burning as they found Zara, who stood equally torn, equally marked by the night, and in the shadow of destruction he stepped closer, his hand lifting hesitantly to her cheek, his touch trembling not from weakness, but from the unbearable weight of choice, and when his voice finally came, it was softer than she had ever heard, raw as flesh without armor. If I share my crown, Zara, it will not be because I was forced, it will be because I cannot imagine wearing it without you. And her breath caught, her tears burning, her lips trembling because those words were not surrender, but something greater, something closer to love than power had ever allowed. And when she whispered back, "Then don't imagine, live it," the crown shifted once more, lighter this time, less burden and more bond, and in that moment, amid the ruins, amid the betrayals, amid the fire and the flesh, the lion finally bowed, not to weakness, not to fear, but to the only force that had ever rivaled him, the woman who had turned a blind date into destiny. And the city, broken and bloodied, seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what kind of empire they would build together when power and love stood as equals. Their story not ending in ashes, but in the dangerous, beautiful promise of tomorrow.